right. Hopefully you can see my slides just as I intend them. Okay, great. I saw that thumbs up. So thanks. We're gonna talk a little bit here about RIM systems and starting out just with the shape of the agenda. As we prepared for this presentation, I thought about the parable of the blind man and the elephant, where each of us have limited exposure and expertise, related to just a part of a complex entity. In this case, open access book publishing and the workflows that disseminate these books and the metadata they have for discovery, access, reuse, and now for RIM systems, which are fairly recent sort of entry into the US research ecosystem. So our effort here is to sort of look and examine, and connect different parts of this broader elephant so that we hopefully all see a bigger picture. So I'm going to start by identifying the challenges at the end of the pipeline where open access books and monographs and book chapters in general are not getting into RIM systems. I'll talk about what RIM systems are and why libraries and their parent institutions should care. Terry's going to then take over at the beginning of the story using the example of open access monographs published by Lever Press. She's going to talk about current practices, challenges with metadata moving through the pipeline, and opportunities for improvement. And then Jeff is going to continue the story by talking about the specific open access monograph story as they arrive, or more likely don't arrive, in the RIM ecosystem at Penn State University specifically. We're going to conclude with some overall recommendations, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So I'm Rebecca Bryant. I'm a senior program officer working with OCLC Research. My area of interest and focus is scholarly communications. My background is peripatetic, interesting. I spent much of my career in academic affairs, working in the graduate school at the University of Illinois as an assistant dean. That actually led me into scholarly communications because I oversaw thesis deposit, implementation of electronic dissertations at Illinois, and also really promoting the open access of those contents. Those then led me to be program officer at OCLC, to be community director at ORCID for a couple of years before returning back to Illinois, leading the implementation of the RIM system there before coming here to OCLC. And you'll be hearing about my research here. So RIM systems, what the heck is a research information management system? In a recent report published last November at OCLC, we define RIM systems as those that support the transparent aggregation, curation, and utilization of data about institutional research activities. That includes publications. That's the part we tend to think of first, but it may also include grants. It may also include equipment used. It's going to include information about the researchers doing that work. But it's really, what is our institution producing related to research information management? It's a bucket of information that then we can use to support a number of different uses. So when I'm talking about this space, I like to sort of point to things that people are probably already familiar with. So big umbrella, but lots of different products that you may be familiar with in this space. Pure and Elements are probably the most widely used RIM systems in the US. They come from sort of the European environment where they're considered typical CRIS systems. But then we also have sort of a US birthed version of this, which are open source products that were seeded by the National Institutes of Health. And they really are public portals supporting team science and expertise discovery, sort of, doing some of the same things, but coming from a different point of view. Here's another point of view, are things that tend to be called faculty activity reporting products like Interfolio or like Watermark's Faculty Success, which has also had some different names along the way. We see a number of homegrown systems, of course, in this space as well. And then we also see Elements as also filling some of the gaps in the faculty activity reporting space. couple of new entrants should also be acknowledged in this space. And that's the Esploro product that's now Ex Libris Clarivate, as well as Cayuse has a product they call Repository. Both of these are fairly new entrants, and they attempt to sort of be a hybrid repository RIM system. And there's some movement in this space here. So this is a confusing space, especially here in the United States, because we have a lot of different uses. We call them a lot of different things. I would really like for us to come together and call them RIM systems, but we might also be calling them researcher profile systems, expert finder systems, research networking systems, faculty activity reporting systems, and people sometimes still call them CRIS systems, but it doesn't really mean the same thing that it does in Europe. And that's why I often make the joke that really here in the United States, we have just this alphabet soup, and often we're not talking with each other about this space, we're talking sort of across each other. Why? Well, we don't have the same environment that Europe has. We have a lot of different use cases, and that's often developed by different people at your institution. So a lot of different communities supporting these. We have a lot of different stakeholders. So often they're off doing their own thing. They don't know what other people are doing. But perhaps most importantly, we don't have the same sort of national environment like the UK's REF that requires collecting of this information in a really systematic and consistent way for compliance monitoring. Instead, we have things that are driven by a very diverse stakeholder community within each of our own institutions. And see, that's why we see, a lot of messiness, frankly, here in the United States, driven by institutional leaders to serve external audiences or support economic development, town-gown relations. And then stakeholders also include folks like corporate relations or advancement. Libraries, of course, are a major stakeholder and should always be a major stakeholder because they're the ones who really understand the publications metadata in this landscape. And then, of course, we have the folks who run the systems, the practitioners themselves. This has been an area of study for us at OCLC for several years. And so we published 3 reports, but the one I have circled here was a joint effort that we conducted with Eurocris, which is the professional organization of RIM systems, if you will, for Europe and beyond. This survey gave us a sample of close to 400 institutions, but frankly, it gave us a really lousy sample for the United States. We just couldn't draw any great conclusions about the US space. And I credit the confusion in the space about what we call it really contributing to this. So instead, we took a different approach that resulted in these 2 reports that came out last November called Research Information Management in the United States. And in this, we took a case study approach instead of a survey approach. And we looked at 5 US research institutions, and we tried to examine all the different RIM practices at each of these 5 institutions. We chose these institutions because they used different products, they had different use cases, they had scales below the institution, above the institution, all the institution. And we interviewed nearly 40 people in order to collect information about these 5 case studies. And as always, this report at the link here is available open access. What we found were 6 high-level use cases. Public portal being the one we see the most of. Let's expose the research of the institution to support expertise discovery, economic development, promote the reputation of the institution. But once we have that information, we can use it for metadata reuse, say to update faculty web pages. Reuse once, enter once, reuse often. Other institutions are using this for strategic reporting. The content that can be collected in the system really makes accreditation preparation so much easier. It also can really help with strategic planning as well as strategic preparation for competitive grants, especially large grants. We also see this information being used for faculty activity reporting. It sort of set aside. It looks a little different. It's really workflow dependent, but it's also collecting a lot of the same information. And that's why I really think it's important to think of these things together. The last two are the smaller use cases here in the US, but they're also still really important. So for some institutions, they may have, such as Penn State, that has a local open access policy. And a lot of institutions are interested in making it as easy as possible for researchers at their institution to know what works are eligible for deposit in the repository, to provide the metadata for them and to streamline this process. So that's part of that open access workflow. And then also compliance monitoring is a tiny part, but I expect it to grow as we see more needs related to compliance with large federal funding requirements. So what did we find? Most institutions have multiple RIM systems supporting multiple uses. 3 of our institutions had at least 3 RIM systems. 1 had 2, and 1, Virginia Tech, sort of gets the gold star here for really working collaboratively across campus and implementing just 1. This red line are the public portal use cases. So you can see that's something we found everywhere. Often like for Penn State, for most of the institution, for Texas A&M, all of the institution, for UCLA, for biomedical part of the institution. You're probably saying, what's going on with Miami there? That's kind of weird. We've got a legacy system, which is Pure. They're planning to move to a system, but that's not reached maturity. That's Esploro. But there's also a statewide system, which includes STEM researchers from the University of Miami, aggregated with content from other Florida research institutions. So we also found a lot of institutions have a centralized faculty activity reporting system. Interfolio is in the process of being implemented at Texas A&M. Miami is also sort of the unusual one here, although only among our sample. I think they're actually quite common, is they don't have a centralized system. It's still dispersed across the different colleges. And finally, 2 of our institutions had used the open access workflow. And these were the 2 institutions, Penn State and UCLA's parent institution, the University of California, have an institutional open access policy that they are using a RIM system to support. So taking a step back, RIM systems are made possible because of content dispersed across the network and because we're able to collect it through metadata harvesting at scale. This is really made possible because we have persistent identifiers like DOIs and ORCIDs and RORs to disambiguate all the different content out there. And it's also made possible because of large aggregations of this content, usually article content, from sources like PubMed, Scopus, and Web of Science. I can remember earlier in my career where we were really reliant upon the proxies of research productivity, and we still do to some extent. Things like number of PhD degrees awarded, number of NIH or NSF dollars awarded. But today, because we can aggregate content at scale, we actually have other ways of understanding the research activity of our institution. So for example, here at the University of Minnesota, we see that in 2019, we know of at least 11,479 publications. That's something that can't be known without the ability to harvest metadata at scale. So let's really talk about what this is and relate it back to what you all are concerned about, that is open access publishing and making that content available and discoverable and giving the authors the recognition that they deserve. So publication databases, as well as local data sources like HR or grants, all can be a data source that sort of come in through this funnel for the core RIM data store. And then through data transfer methods like APIs can be consumed for the 6 use cases I discussed earlier. Now, data sources we typically look at, this is not an exclusive list, but these are the ones that are most widely used, I'd say, are PubMed, Scopus, Web of Science, and Dimension. And they rely upon a publication harvester that's part of or adjacent to most RIM systems. That data can come into the data store, and then it can be used to support the variety of uses. Challenge comes, and you've already been looking at this list and saying, yeah, but what about the books? So yeah, what about the books? The challenge is for all of our institutions, and this is a global challenge, is that books, and especially open access books as well, really require manual entry, or maybe direct import from another data source like MLA bibliography or from WorldCat, but it's a known item search, and a lot of people just report, oh, it's just easier to sort of do the manual entry. This disproportionately impacts humanities and social science scholars who aren't getting the full credit for their work. So, the book chapters, the book chapters, the open access books aren't arriving in these RIM systems. And I think that this is growing in importance because we're seeing a lot of growth in this product category in the United States. We're seeing a lot of adoption of RIM systems. And, I encourage you to think about your own institution. I would wager that all of your institutions have one or more RIM systems, but you might not be aware of that. The challenge, though, then becomes library staff end up requiring a lot of manual entry. So ultimately, I'm here and I'm asking these questions are there ways that we can improve the supply chain so that this content we can save time for libraries, we can make sure that the authors are getting full credit for their work. So Charles Watkinson, Rebecca Weltenbach, and I wrote this guest post for the Scholarly Kitchen on this topic back in December. You can just Google it and find it. But it's really sort of, was sort of the genesis for this presentation. So it is another way of sort of exploring the challenges we're going into more detail about today. So I'm wrapping up. As I do so, I want to invite you to think about a publication within your own publishing catalog, and think about the metadata, and think about the persistent identifiers, and ask yourself, do you think it will make it into the RIM system at the author's institution? So that can be a point, I think, of discussion for us a little bit later. I have a list of references here, and our slides will be made available. I tried to upload them. I'm not sure if it worked. So if anybody from LPC wants to advise on that, it's most welcome. But from here, I will turn it over to Terri, and here's her first slide.
Hello, everyone. I'm Terri Geitgey, and I'm presenting as Program Manager for Lever Press. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start by giving a brief overview of Lever Press for those not familiar with it. Lever is a scholarly press publishing open access, born digital, peer-reviewed works. It's supported by member libraries with a shared commitment to the liberal arts ethos. Because all publishing and operating costs are paid for by the supporting members, there's never a charge to our authors or readers. It's governed by an oversight committee, which is made up of elected representatives from the member libraries. The editorial program is shaped by an editorial board of faculty from the supporting institutions, and it's led by an acquiring editor. It focuses on publications that support undergraduate teaching and learning in the humanities and social sciences. Lever publishes every title as an open access ebook under a Creative Commons license, plus a companion print-on-demand version whenever possible. Next slide, please. Lever has published 17 titles to date, with many more in the pipeline, and the ultimate goal is to get to the point of publishing 10 to 15 titles per year. Next slide, please. So Lever's workflow is designed to best meet researchers where they're most likely to be searching for materials, and to make it easier for libraries to allow their researchers to access our publications. So this diagram illustrates the flow of Lever titles and metadata. The book content is created in the form of EPUB and PDF files, along with title metadata. The metadata records are created in our instance of Firebrand's title management system, and then flow to the Chicago Distribution Center, or CDC. MARC records are created by the University of Michigan Library. Metadata, cover, and interior files are archived at BiblioVault, which is CDC's digital asset management arm. The open source publishing platform Fulcrum hosts the content and provides preservation copies to CLOCs and Academic Preservation Trust. Metadata and files are delivered to multiple aggregators and discovery platforms. Libraries can upload the MARC records into their local catalogs and configure their discovery services to index the aggregator platforms. Next slide, please. So there are several facets to Lever's publication process that help facilitate discoverability. Next slide. So as I mentioned previously, Lever titles are hosted on Michigan's open source publishing platform, Fulcrum. The hosted titles can be read online for free or downloaded in EPUB and/or PDF formats. Fulcrum exposes metadata and creates sitemaps, enabling the site to be crawled and indexed, including by Google Scholar. Next slide, please. The Library creates high-quality MARC records for the Lever titles that include open access indicators. These records are available for free download from the LeverPress website under a CC0 license. The records are also distributed to EBSCO Discovery Service, Ex Libris Summon, and OCLC WorldCat Discovery via the same process that sends the University of Michigan Press's ebook collection MARC records to these services. Next slide, please. Title level DOIs for each LeverPress title are registered with Crossref. Each ebook is assigned an open access ISBN, and the print-on-demand versions are assigned paperback ISBNs. A separate metadata record is created for each format. If an author or contributor has an ORCID, we can include this in the metadata record, though we don't currently require ORCIDs from our authors. Next slide, please. The metadata is harvested nightly from our TMM by the Chicago Distribution Center. It's then ingested into their title management system and distributed to their digital asset archiving and distribution arm, BiblioVault. Sales channels receive metadata and cover images for the print-on-demand versions through CDC's Eloquence feed. BiblioVault delivers metadata and EPUB and PDF files to various aggregators and discovery services, including JSTOR Open Access Books, Muse Open, and OAPN, which then feeds the directory of open access books. Next slide, please. So these are the eVendor platforms where BiblioVault delivers LeverPress title files and metadata. The locations include a mix of those focused on accessibility, search indexing, and open access. Next slide. So there are a number of points in the process where problems can occur, resulting in missing metadata, missing titles on eVendor sites, or titles getting stuck in the transfer process. Occasionally, a metadata field in our TMM record is incomplete, and BiblioVault alerts us that they can't make a delivery without that content. Sometimes CDC can't successfully ingest our metadata, or the complete metadata doesn't flow to BiblioVault due to a system glitch. Once in a while, the title appears on the eVendor platform without its cover image. In those instances, we can log into our eVendor publisher account and manually upload the missing image. In some cases, BiblioVault has delivered the files and metadata as requested, but the title doesn't appear on the eVendor site. This may be due to the vendor's acceptance criteria or the specific requirements of the eVendor's system. Understanding that system behavior allows us to identify the cause and work with the vendor to make adjustments. Next slide, please. So as Firebrand makes changes to the title management system, it's important that we keep our record creation process documentation up to date. An added help is that Firebrand has recently revamped its metadata verification and validation functionality, which makes it easier to check the records for errors or omissions before the metadata is distributed. The University of Michigan Press is beginning to work out a process for assigning DOIs at the chapter level for some of its ELT titles. Lever Press could use these same procedures once established. As part of Lever's acquisition process, we do now request ORCIDs from authors and contributors, although I don't believe we've actually been able to record any thus far, since the use of ORCIDs is less common in the humanities than the sciences. As part of the research conducted for this presentation, we checked Lever authors and contributors' faculty profile pages and/or personal websites to see if their Lever title or contribution to an edited volume was mentioned. Roughly 2/3 of the sites we located made no mention of their Lever publication. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks, Rebecca, for advancing slides. I'm going to kind of be the case study person today, going back to what Rebecca started with, talking about the specific case of Penn State and how it handles RIMS here. So there are actually three, and those are the three leaky silos I'm referencing in my title. Next slide, please. So we have three here at Penn State, the three being Watermark Faculty Success, which has had many names. Some of you might know it as Digital Measures or Activity Insight, Pure, and as Rebecca mentioned, our homegrown research metadata database. So the faculty success portion of this is really run by faculty and has and it relates to their P&T silo. So this is a manual entry silo. It's what faculty use to track their publications. It has limited capacity for ingesting data from other sources, and it only contains PIDs like ORCIDs if the faculty obtain and add them. So it's very manual entry, as Rebecca said, and it doesn't really talk to a lot of other systems. The second one is Pure, which is the Elsevier product. It harvests most of its data from Scopus, and it also gets abstract and citation information from Elsevier's own database. It also includes grant information. So Rebecca mentioned that earlier as well. And I don't know that many faculty do this, but faculty do have the option or the ability to go in and tweak their Pure profiles and manually add stuff that has somehow been overlooked or missing. And then finally, the research metadata database was our local attempt here at Penn State to try to do what Rebecca was alluding to earlier, where we bring everything into one silo and kind of harvest at scale from a greater number of silos. So you can see some of the ones I have listed on the slide. It harvests from our instance of Pure. It harvests from Watermark Faculty Success. It also harvests from our ETD server, which is our electronic theses and dissertation server. It harvests from some of our news feeds. It harvests from ScholarSphere, which is our Penn State institutional repository. It harvests from Web of Science, It harvests from the NSF, from OA Button, from Unpaywall, and from our own LDAP system. So it tries to be more global in its reach for data. Next slide, please. So what we did here is kind of a test to see how leaky these silos were and how the information for open access materials did or did not arrive in these systems. I think we all know that things like Web of Science and Scopus are strong when it comes to articles, and there is kind of this disciplinary breakdown between the STEM disciplines that are really emphasizing articles and the humanities and social sciences, which have a much stronger emphasis on the scholarly monograph. So open access monographs in RIM systems, what we did was we identified 11 open access monographs by Penn State authors published by university presses as part of the TOME project. I hope that most of you are aware of the TOME project. That's an acronym for Towards an Open Monograph Ecosystem. And then we searched for these titles in our 3 different RIM systems. Now, Watermark faculty success is kind of a closed silo. Unless you have access in an account, which I do not, you cannot search it. So it's not a publicly available system. But I'm presuming, after talking to several faculty here at Penn State, that since they have a vested interest in manually entering their data because it relates directly to their promotion and tenure, that we can assume that the authors of these open access monographs were vigilant in entering their data into Watermark faculty success. For Pure, our instance of Pure, interestingly, none of the 11 open access monographs was listed, which was kind of surprising to me. In our research metadata database, which, remember, Harvard's data from several different silos, only one of these 11 open access monographs titles made it into that silo. So a first conclusion that can be drawn then is that open access monographs are much less likely to feed into these systems as they're currently configured and how the metadata is currently designed. Conversely, if you go down to the final bullet point on that slide, you'll see that we also identified 4 open access monographs by Penn State authors that had been published not with university presses, but with Springer Nature. And we found that 3 of the 4 of those are listed in our instance of Pure. And that sets up a pattern that we've seen repeatedly, where the big publishers, the Elsevier's, the Springer Natures, et cetera, are very good at getting their data into these systems, partially no doubt in Elsevier's case because they own the system, but also because they have the presence in the marketplace to make sure that these feeds happen the way they should so that the metrics come out accordingly. Next slide, please. So initial thoughts, and some of these will overlap with what both Terri and Rebecca were saying about how do we address this need that we see. First of all, university presses have to be aware of the implications of the OA publications not showing up in these systems. Speaking for myself here at Penn State, my wheelhouse tends to be metadata. I'm a cataloger by training, and I tend not to think about metadata outside the little realm in which it lives for me. And I think we all have to think more holistically about the way the metadata flows through our systems, where it's coming from and where it's ending up, so that we're more sensitized to what happens to it outside of our own bailiwicks. And this would be an example of that. As Terri mentioned earlier, Lever does not currently require ORCIDs from their authors, but I think it would behoove a lot of university presses to encourage authors to obtain ORCIDs as part of the publication process, if not require them, so that the metadata can be more machine actionable and doesn't rely on trying to match personal names, which is a fraught process at best. Another thing that Terri mentioned was Lever Press beginning to or considering assigning DOIs at the chapter level in addition to the book level. This is one thing that you see in terms of granularity of content. Again, the STEM disciplines tend to work at a different level of granularity with chapters, or with articles, excuse me, which each have their own DOI, whereas many scholarly monographs, open access monographs, have a DOI at the title level, but fail to have those assigned at the individual chapter levels. And for books, for example, that are edited volumes or conference proceedings where you have multiple authors and multiple chapters with multiple statements of responsibility, it would really help the systems ingest this data if the DOIs were more granular and pointed at individual chapters rather than just titles. Fourthly, and this goes back to the first point, is that in discussions with authors from presses, encourage the authors to be sensitive to what happens to the data and the upsides of making sure that their publications end up in these RIM systems where they need to be, not just in their own P&T system, but in Pure and whatever other systems are in use at your campuses. RIM system vendors like Elsevier should be lobbied to do a more thorough job. I know that Charles Watkinson, to whom Rebecca alluded earlier, has been in conversation with a couple of these folks trying to get greater insight into why open access monographs tend to not make it into these systems with the same alacrity or the same consistency that articles or things that aren't open access normally do. And then finally, I'm going to kind of segue into an ending before we make some global recommendations and just talk a little bit about data protection. You know, we all kind of take for granted the importance of data privacy working in presses and libraries, but we need to make sure that when we're dealing with entities like Elsevier or like other for-profit organizations, that the agreements we sign with them take into account the fact that we don't want any data that we're giving to them to be sold or leveraged in other ways that are outside the scope of what we deem to be protected. Next slide, please. So in the form of a warning, the metadata should be protected just like the content. We want the content should be open, but we also want the metadata to be shared and to be living freely in the ecosystem and not monetized or misused by for-profit entities. As we mentioned on a previous slide, current REM data flows seem to favor for-profit monopolies or near monopolies like Elsevier and like Springer Nature. So we want to try to break that and make sure that the data flows are more ecumenical and everything that we want to see in those silos gets into those silos and doesn't leak or leach out. And somebody who's made the point better than I could here is Sarah Lambden, a law librarian, who wrote an article in the Library with the Lead Pipe a few years ago about the sale of data that's gathered by universities or libraries. Next slide. And I'm not going to read the slide, but it's a quote from her article, which is an excellent read. And it just talks about how libraries need to be aware of what happens to the data that they kind of steward at certain points in the process. But if they're not careful about what happens to that data after it leaves their kind of silos, it can be used for purposes that we might not as a community agree with. So finally, I think, Rebecca, do we have one more slide with the recommendations on it? Yeah, so I'll summarize these briefly and then we'll have time for conversation. Rebecca very helpfully kind of broke these out into the different areas. You know, for publishers, adopt identifiers to the extent possible, encourage the adoption of ORCIDs, use DOIs at the chapter level if possible, use other PIDs like RORs so that the metadata is more machine actionable, examine workflows to optimize OA publications in these systems so that they get the visibility that they deserve. Universities on a more global scale, again, encourage the adoption of ORCIDs among your researchers. And include provisions in your contracts for data ownerships so that these things are protected and we know what happens to them down the road. For authors, we encourage you to sign up for ORCIDs or other PIDs and to enter them where you need to enter them in your RIM systems, or to make sure that they exist in the systems that are able to ingest them. And finally, content platforms. Try to maximize your systems to be able to ingest more books and chapters and not just focus on articles. And finally, be transparent. This is important so that everybody looking at your system can understand where the data originates, how the data is created, where the data ends up, and who's getting to see it and use it. So with that, I think we're done with our slides. I'll open the floor up to questions or comments. Thank you.